Okay, hello everyone. My name is Kevin Harris. I'm a professor in sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Hello from Los Angeles. Welcome to this event on the politics of inflation. It's an excellent panel, and on behalf of my colleagues, C.K. Lee and Robert Brenner, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Center for Social Theory and Comparative History here at UCLA. If you are not following us on various social media, we have social media accounts that are more active these days, and almost all of our panels that are Zoom presented end up on our YouTube page, including the panel we held on April 4th, the political economy of Russia's war in Ukraine, which was a widely attended and excellent panel. So as was in the Financial Times yesterday morning, the headlines are routinely covering the topic of inflation, or even worse, the possibility of stagflation, meaning low growth and high inflation, prompting all kinds of hand-wringing from different sectors of the economic elite. So given that alongside discussion of inflation in headline news and discussion by the Federal Reserve about what to do about it, there's been a robust debate about drivers of inflation, drawing both on heterodox economics as well as historical comparative accounts of drivers of inflation across space and time. So, we're very excited to have a panel today of speakers on the topic, given that, the term itself is thrown around as an excuse to engage in all types of policy proposals. So let me introduce the speakers and our discussant, and remind everyone that everyone in the room right now is a participant in our panel. And after the speakers and our discussant, we'll open it up for Q&A, and you'll be able to share your video if you like, and ask questions via audio to our participants. So we're looking forward to that. Our panel is very excited to have our speakers today. First up is going to be Professor Isabella Weber. She's a political economist and assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's author of 2021's How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate, which is winner of the Joan Robinson Prize and is being translated into numerous languages, as I can attest. Next, we're going to have a presentation by Tim Barker, who's finishing up his PhD in history at Harvard. He's on the editorial board of Phenomenal World, a kind of blog out of the Berggruen Institute think tank, and Dissent. And actually, last year he wrote an excellent essay called "Preferred Shares: Inflation and Wages in the 50-Year Crisis" on Phenomenal World. And then our discussant is going to be UCLA's alum, Aaron Benanav, who's an economic historian and social theorist. Currently, Aaron is a postdoc at Humboldt University, but he's an incoming assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, and he is the author of the equally well-translated Automation and the Future of Work, which came out in 2020 on Verso. So we're going to have presentations by Isabella, and then Tim, and then a discussion by Aaron, and then we'll open up to the audience, and I'll be moderating. Thanks to Bob and CK for co-organizing this panel, and to Rohan Ivani, our graduate student organizer as well, who's going to be running behind the scenes. So let's get started with Isabella. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. This is exceedingly exciting. Thank you so much to the organizing team and to this kind invitation. It's hard to think of a more pressing issue these days. And as someone who has mainly worked historically, it's very thrilling to try to make sense of an issue that is really at the edge of our time. My talk is titled Politics and Economics of the Post-Shutdown Inflation. And I'm basically trying to address the three broad questions, which is what drives inflation? How can we make sense of this inflationary dynamic? Secondly, what are the social and political implications of this inflation? Looking both at the US and internationally. And thirdly, what can be done? And I'm saying here some thoughts, because I think it's really a very, very difficult question and has to be acknowledged as such, which requires for us to have an open debate about what can be done rather than to revert to some sort of standard answers of one kind or another. I'm proposing what I'm here preliminarily calling a Kaldorian-Galbraithian perspective as a framework to make sense of the inflationary dynamic. Kaldor famously had two pricing regimes. The first for the raw materials sector, where he basically sees the raw material or commodity sector as the Marshallian kind of sector where supply and demand in the world commodity markets would be determining prices. Since the adjustment of supply in these very, very capital intensive sectors is very slow, this means that you have inherently volatile prices, which results in a constant destabilizing dynamic, both for the economies of the global north and the global south. So both for the economies that are highly commodity dependent, as well as for the economies that are importing these raw materials for their industrial production, thinking broadly speaking in a north-south kind of view of the word. The second pricing regime is that for the industrial sector, where the basic rule is one of cost plus markup pricing. The idea is that you have very highly concentrated sectors, large corporations that are basically more or less planning their production in Kaldor's time, yet not yet in international supply networks, but nevertheless in highly concentrated sectors, where an increase in cost induces an increase in prices. So in other words, cost increases are handed down to consumers. And these cost increases tend to be more than the initial cost increase, since firms are hedging their profit margins against future increases. So there's an assumption if raw material prices are going up, then they tend to keep going up for a while. So since industrial firms are only setting their prices relatively infrequently, they price in future cost increases in their price increases. That being said, in quote unquote normal or stable times, an increase in demand does not induce an increase in prices in Kaldor's thinking. Instead, an increase in demand results in an increase in supply to satisfy this demand, so a quantity response, which means that the prices are largely stable as long as these firms can respond to an increased demand by simply increasing their capacity utilization. And in fact, in many ways, in our just-in-time production networks world that we have inherited and that seems to be crumbling in front of our eyes, this logic of just-in-time increase in supply was, if anything, stronger than it would have been in Kaldor's times. So in many ways, while these just-in-time production networks were working as they were designed to work efficiently and swiftly, they were basically even more sensitive to increases in demand than the old kind of model. However, in the older model, that slower responsiveness would have been compensated with inventories, whereas now inventories tend to be lower than in the world that Kaldor was describing. For the industrial sector, I think we can extend the Kaldorian view with Galbraith's analysis of inflation, where Galbraith points out that corporations always have a latent tendency to use their market power in order to take advantage of opportunities that arise in order to increase prices and thus increase profits. However, without any kind of pretext, if a firm unilaterally increases prices in normal times, this would be to their disadvantage in terms of their market position, or in other words, they would harm their competitive position. This is why sector-wide events serve as some sort of a legitimation and coordination device for price hikes. And the example that Galbraith gave was that wage rises result in price rises, not because there's some sort of a universal economic law that wage increases always must result in increases in prices. In fact, Ricardo, of course, argued exactly the opposite, but rather because union sectoral bargaining creates a pretext for the whole sector to increase its prices, which means that they are coordinatedly increasing prices, which means that one firm increasing prices will not harm its competitive position towards another firm. Now, in the context that we are living in, I think we can think of the cost push dynamic that we have observed together with the broken supply chains as such a pretext that functions in a similar kind of way as what Galbraith describes for union bargaining agreements for whole sector. Of course, we have to add in terms of the institutional environment, shareholder primacy and the role of asset managers as a new kind of institutional context, which to some degree can also function as a sectoral coordinating kind of dynamic. The argument that I'm making in a nutshell is then that there is a cost push dynamic from increased commodity prices, which started long before the war and has accelerated sharply since. Secondly, that supply chain issues impede the supply adjustments that we would be seeing in normal times, where an increase in demand or even a falling short of supply in relation to demand would be compensated for by an expansion of demand. So therefore, the same mechanisms that before the crisis created pretty stable and often even slightly falling prices now reside in a dynamic that creates increasing prices. Commodity price increases in broken supply chains then present a pretext for synchronized price increases across sectors, where you basically have a switch from competition over increased market shares to competition over short-term price hikes, which intensifies some pre-pandemic trends of shareholder and asset manager primacy. Initially, this was, I think, predominantly a sectoral story, a story of specific price increases. However, as these profit and price hikes have become more widespread, it seems that we are entering more and more into a generalized dynamic of price increases and profit hikes. So far, price increases have largely been accommodated by demand. In particular, prices of many goods for which demand is relatively inelastic have been going up, things like fuel, food, and shelter. And their consumers, or I mean, whatever you want to call people who are demanding these things, naturally don't have a lot of wiggle room to escape. So in other words, they're in some sense forced to accommodate these kind of price increases. So in some sense, I'm presenting here a story that is predominantly supply driven, highly institutionally dependent, and at the same time, one that can result in a spiraling dynamic that is pretty difficult to control. I'm now going to zoom in a little bit into some data. I realized that Tim also has some similar data in his presentation, so I hope that overlap won't be too much. So first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that even though we have now all started to talk about commodity prices, the commodity price increases predate the war. And this is the case not only for the energy index, this is here IMF data, but also for things like food, but also important industrial inputs such as metals. So we can see here that the non-fuel index also had a pretty sharp increase, not quite as sharp as the energy index, but nevertheless, pretty intense increases. And this has been the case for a whole range of important industrial inputs. Then, of course, as we are all aware, in the context of the war, these commodity price increases have just gone through the roof. So famously in early March, there was this weekly rise on largest weekly rise on record. And importantly, food prices are basically skyrocketing. Now, most of the discussion around these increasing commodity prices has some implicit assumptions on input-output relationships, but I have seen very, very little work that actually looks at these input-output relationships. And this is something that I've started doing. I'm still at the very beginning, since the data is just coming out and so on. And this is work jointly with a number of co-authors. So on the left-hand side here, you can see a scatter plot of industries ranked based on their upstreamness on the horizontal axis, where upstreamness, very loosely speaking, basically measures for how many industries a good is an input and how important of an input it is. So if you compare, for example, chocolate and oil, then chocolate would be much, much more downstream than oil, because oil is, of course, an input to many more things than chocolate. So the further out you get, the more you get into stuff like oil, the further to the left, the more you get into stuff like chocolate. And on the vertical axis here, I've plotted the yearly price change in 2020 to 2021 for Q4. And we can see that some industries stand out. So for example, for oil and gas extraction, we have very high upstreamness and very high price increase, above 60%. Similarly for primary metals, but also for, importantly, transportation, wood products, fabricated metals, and a range of other upstream goods. Now, what one can do with input-output models is to estimate what the impact of such upstream price increases on the consumer price index would be. And there's basically a direct impact and an indirect impact, where the direct impact is, for example, if you take fuel, is the impact on the fuel price that you get at the gas station. But then there's, of course, also a very large indirect impact, because pretty much everything that we are consuming has a component of fuel. And we have now started to rank industries by their combined CPI impact, taking account of the indirect and direct effects. And what we can see is that petroleum and coal products are, of course, the first and most important industry. Utilities more generally are incredibly important. Chemical products, housing, because of the very large direct effect, food, beverages, and tobacco. So these are the top 5 industries, which basically have enormous impacts on the CPI, even though we would not be thinking of them immediately if we think about consumer prices. Okay, when prices go up in such a way on the commodity markets, there are, of course, always some winners. So you can see here on the upper left-hand side, a graph where we are plotting the input prices and output prices for oil and gas extraction. And you can see that the output price is shooting up towards the end of the graph here. And this is only for 2021, so we haven't even included the 2022 Ukraine war context prices yet. And this increase is much larger than the increase in input prices, which of course means that someone must be reaping that difference. And in fact, as the profit numbers are gradually coming out, we can see that the fossil fuel industry has of course benefited massively from this. But this does not only go for fossil fuel, this also goes for grains. So for example, the giant corporation Cargill had the best year in 156 years in 2021. This is from August 2021, so before the price explosions in the context of the Ukraine-Russian war. And similarly, this family, relatedly, this family now has actually ascended to some of the richest people in the world. In this context, I think the Groundwork Collaborative should really be mentioned here, since they have done relentless work to skim through earnings calls and have basically shown that across a whole range of sectors, we can find again and again the story that there's a broad-based passing on of cost increases, which is completely consistent with the Kaldorian story that I have presented, and also proud announcements of profit increases that go beyond the increase in costs, which then reside in price hikes and profit hikes. In fact, also if we look at studies as, for example, by McKinsey and Company, we can find consulting documents that promise to win the race with inflation, the pricing opportunity for industrial companies to increase prices more than cost. So within the business world, if we look closely, this is pretty explicit. We can also see this in the national income data. So this is here plotting profits with inventory adjustment after tax in the upper part and before tax in the lower part, which you will see that obviously the tax rates have declined dramatically, which makes the before tax distribution look a little bit less dramatic in terms of the increase in profit margins. But if we do care what ends up in corporate balance sheets at the end of the day, so if we do care about after tax, then we can see that basically profit margins are as high as they haven't been since the immediate post-war period. There is an interesting curiosity in the data, which is that basically the inventory adjustment became very large in 2021, which I think is pretty consistent with the theoretical framework that I've presented for you, where basically as supply chains started to become unstable, corporations have switched to some sort of auctioning of their inventories, which means that while in normal times we want to extract the value of inventories from our accounting for profits, in the particular 2021 context, the very sharp increase in prices for inventories was actually part of the story of inflation. This then raises the question of historical analogies, and of course there has been a lot of debate around this. I personally have been arguing in agreement with the White House Council of Economic Advisors that there's some parallel with the inflationary episode after World War II, when price controls were released, and basically there was a relatively strong demand thanks to savings during the war, and there were very widespread supply chain issues, which resulted in inelastic supply and relatively high demand, which resulted in windfall profits and the shooting up of specific prices. However, as all historical analogies, this is an imperfect historical analogy, since overlapping with this, we have this very widespread commodity price explosion, which has some resemblance with the oil shock in the 1970s, but it's not just about oil, but it's really very, very, very broad based. And then unlike after the war in 1946, 47, we are of course at the beginning of a war. So we are not, and the pandemic is also not over. So in that sense, we are in a much more erratic kind of scenario than this clear end of the war, post-war inflation boom and then sharp downturn. As regards the outlook, I'm rather pessimistic. And I think we have to recognize that the increasing cost pressures from these enormous increases in raw material prices and continuously breaking supply chains. I mean, China is only now entering into COVID-19 shutdowns, is only about to percolate through the system, and that it might well be the case that cost increases are so sharp that not the whole cost increase can be passed on, which could result in a situation where even though prices are continue to be increased by firms, they nonetheless end up seeing diminishing margins, which could add to a stagflationary dynamic. Being mindful of time, I just very quickly skip through this. So basically we see that income inflation, specific inflation impacts in the United States have been to the detriment of lower income groups. Not only have they seen higher inflation rates, but also lower income groups and middle income groups were less able to make up for increased inflation with higher earnings. This, I think, is politically extremely explosive. And I think that what happened with Le Pen should really stand as a warning for all of us, where basically her catch up in the last months has been driven by her capitalizing on the cost of living crisis. The food price crisis is a global, enormous crisis, and I think has to be taken absolutely seriously, not least because of the enormous explosive nature of such of these food price increases, but of course also simply because the UN has been warning of an imminent famine and starvation. So what is to be done? Rising interest rates seems to be the default option that economists revert to. However, this is of course based on inducing economic hardship by lowering aggregate demand, basically by trying to manufacture unemployment. I personally think that it's more likely that this policy will succeed in manufacturing unemployment, but will not necessarily succeed in bringing down inflation, since inflation is coming from this massive cost push dynamic. It would also likely be detrimental to investments, where investments would be what we need to fix some of the issues that have come up in this crisis. Importantly, rising interest rates is extraordinarily dangerous for the global South, and might well produce a debt crisis on a scale that is simply terrifying. And if we take this together with the looming food security crisis, then I think this should really make us think twice. Income transfers in rich countries are, of course, nice and welcome. However, they do not stop the inflationary dynamic. Windfall profits, tax, and antitrust are important policy tools, but they tend to be retroactive, and they're really in an emergency situation. So in many ways, we would need to act quickly. Food aid and loans programs to developing countries can play an important role in buffering the impact of the rising food prices. However, the terms of such loans would be absolutely crucial, since in particular, if we see rising interest rates, which seems the likely outcome, then we don't want to further exacerbate the already looming debt crisis. I think that a stabilization of global commodity markets should have happened before one imposes sanctions on the scale on which they have been imposed. And of course, stocks have been released in the realm of oil, but much more would need to be done in the realm of food, and also in the realm of oil and metals and other basic commodities. And we would need to think about measures that can limit market fluctuations in the context of this enormous volatility that we have observed. The EU Commission has recommended a gas price control plan on the European level, which is an interesting proposal. Price caps for basic needs in essential realms could also play a role, where as regards CO2 intensive goods such as fuel, one could think of a sliding scale where basically some sort of basic consumption need is covered at a low price, but then the more you consume, the higher the price gets, so that those who are consuming much have to pay a very high price that reflects the high environmental costs. From a long run perspective, I think we really need to think about regimes that can stabilize global commodity prices. One idea that has been around for a very long time is the idea of global buffer stocks. Finally, and relatedly, as regards supply chains, I personally don't think that trying to rip supply chains apart in the middle of this enormous crisis would be a good idea, but rather that global coordination is necessary in order to stabilize supply chains. In sum, I'm of the opinion that that inflation is an enormously difficult challenge, and that it has to be taken seriously, and that we really need a broad discussion around different tools and how they can be part of the broader policy response, rather than to search for some sort of one magic bullet or to revert to knee-jerk reactions based on some sort of one standard model or another. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Isabella. So let's turn it over to Tim Barker, who's going to follow up. Tim, are you ready?
Yeah, are the slides showing up?
We got it. Yep.
Great. Okay, Well, thanks, Kevin and Rowan and everyone at the center for putting this together and for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be on the panel with Isabella, who's really been at the forefront of these conversations for months now. So I'm a historian by training, and my talk is going to focus on trying to put the contemporary inflation in perspective, going back to the 1970s and thinking a little bit about the path from the 70s until today and similarities and differences between the two experiences, which are now frequently compared in the media. And I start with this image of 1979 in reverse, which was used by the French economist Cédric Durand on the New Left Review blog about a year ago in June 2021. And I've added a question mark because I think it's not clear, especially now, whether we really are in 1979 in reverse. But I think it's a good frame for looking at the current inflation. And 1979 here refers to the Volcker shock, right? The sharp, unforeseen increase in interest rates set by the US Federal Reserve under the chairmanship of Paul Volcker, which had the effect of causing a very sharp contraction in demand and a depression really all over the world, which was felt especially in commodity exporting countries, but also right here in the more advanced capitalist countries. And what this chart tries to represent is it shows you the unemployment rate, and the red line shows a kind of baseline of 5% unemployment. And I think if we follow that line through, we can see that there was a decision made in 1979 to basically keep unemployment above a certain level. And in the 80s and early 90s, that was very high. It fell in the late 1990s. But if we see there really hasn't been a period where it's fallen much below 5% until the last 2.5 years, maybe, when we've seen a more sustained fall in measured unemployment than we have at any point since the 70s. And so one way of thinking about what 1979 reverse means or would mean is that there's been a reversal of this policy of intentional slack in the economy as the main way of fighting inflation. For people who are more hawkish on inflation, they would say we've seen 1979 in reverse in a different way, which is that consumer price inflation is now at points unseen since the early 1980s and close to levels right before the Volcker shock. So if you're someone who thinks Volcker did the right thing, then we've recently seen the undoing of a lot of his good works. In the 1970s, before the Volcker shock, one thing that I've just been really struck by in the historical record is that there was not very much sense at all from anyone that there was a market solution to inflation. People really thought that one way or another, the solution would have to be institutional. And that includes right-wing views that saw reform of the labor market, elimination of the minimum wage, elimination of trade unions. In a way, those are free market solutions, but they're also really institutional explanations of what was going on. And so I wanted to just revisit sort of briefly what the left and center left horizon for reforms was before the Volcker shock settled the question by deflation through unemployment. One phrase that was heard widely and was even included in the party platform of the 1976 Democratic Party was this idea of national economic planning. And there was an idea in the United States, especially that was something that other countries like France or Italy or Japan had done, and which the United States needed to catch up with. Now, there was always a kind of intentional vagueness about what this would mean. And the coalition included people who both saw it as a way of making the system work and people who saw it as a way of changing the system. I think partly as a result of that divided meaning that it had, the advocates were divided among themselves and not especially effective. But this was a phrase that was just in the air a lot. Another thing was the idea of an incomes policy, which again is a very vague, really umbrella for any number of measures of limiting wage increases in a coordinated way, with the idea that if you could somehow hold down incomes without relying on unemployment to do so, you could have a moderation of inflation without recession and increased unemployment. And that was also politically tricky because it meant different things to different people. A lot of people in labor were opposed to this because they saw it as something that would work more aggressively on wages than on prices. And that view came out of their experience of wage and price controls during the Nixon administration. So again, a lot of the constituency that might have provided support for this was divided, and yet it was also still a really common idea and remained part of, Gary Hart had a version of the incomes policy as part of his platform in 1984. So it remained part of the conversation even in the first, half decade of the Volcker era. Another idea that was out there, especially around 1973 to 1975, was the idea of nationalizing the oil companies. There was a huge amount of public anger at the oil companies. There was a widespread sense that public opinion polling identified that the oil crisis itself was some kind of a corporate conspiracy rather than a geopolitical or material reality. Here too, I guess this applies to all of the things I'm talking about. There was this policy appealed to different people for different reasons. And a really good example of that is that the strongest advocate in the Senate of nationalizing the oil industry was Scoop Jackson, the senator from Washington, who saw it as really a national security measure. He was a real Cold Warrior. And so again, there's a sort of division among the people who might naturally have been pushing this, but it was very frequently talked about. Another policy that got a hearing in the Carter White House until the late 70s was the idea of a sectoral price policy. And advocates of this approach identified energy, food, healthcare, and housing as the crucial areas which had both seen a lot of the price rises and which were also especially important to working class and poor people's budgets. And so they had an idea that whatever approach you had would have to aim at holding down the prices of these things rather than using interest rates to attack aggregate demand in general. And then finally, this connects to a lot of what Isabella was talking about in the present moment. There was just a huge worldwide discourse around global schemes to stabilize commodity prices, both on the way up so that you wouldn't have sudden spikes, but also on the way down, because countries that relied on these commodity exports for their income knew well from past experience that commodity price spikes are often followed by busts. And so they wanted to sort of use the leverage that the 70s provided them in order to get some kind of guarantee against the bad times. And that also didn't happen, but was something that was taken seriously enough to inspire hope and fear among different people depending on their persuasions. In the end, what happened? We know none of those things happened. Instead, we had a kind of de facto incomes policy under Reagan, which had these four legs I've listed here. One, sort of the most obvious, most familiar one is high unemployment, which had the effect of reducing incomes and consumption and therefore demand. And that had an effect on inflation rather. The second was to really welcome imports, right? And this is a result of the Volcker interest rate hikes was a strengthening in the US dollar, which made imports relatively cheap. At the same time, you had other things going on like a collapse in commodity prices, which had been very high in the 70s, were now very low, largely as a result of the demand contraction that originated in the US. And you also had the coming online of lots of new production capacity in the rest of the world, which provided the sort of potential supply for this big explosion of imports into the United States. And the result was that the volume of imports into the US went up even as the oil price went down. So even after this one item, which had accounted for so much of the US import bill in the 70s, became no longer a problem, you still saw an increase in imports. And so that's also an important part of what the sort of de facto Reagan wage and price policy was. There were other measures too, like keeping the minimum wage set by the federal government unchanged in nominal terms throughout the whole decade, which meant that it was falling in real terms since prices were still increasing at some level. And of course, the assault on labor unions, which really hit its peak around 1981 and 1982 during the recession, but which continued then into the recovery and saw unions continue this pattern of concessionary bargaining even after the expansion had continued. And so that's sort of what happened instead of the left or liberal left reform agenda. There was also, as I mentioned, this sort of fact that the 1970s commodity price boom fell apart. And you see that here, the example on the left is the oil, which you see falls off in a very big way after the beginning of the 1980s, but it wasn't limited to oil by any means. The other graph on here shows you an index for all commodities, which shows not a collapse, but a leveling off in the 1980s, which you can see contrasts quite markedly with the experience in the 1970s. So it wasn't all up to Reagan or Volcker, although their policies by engineering a worldwide contraction did have a big effect on the prices of these commodities. Finally, there was a sort of delayed response from investment in some of the sectors which had been driving the 70s inflation. And on your left, you see an index of investment in mining exploration, shafts and wells for oil. So basically structures supporting new extraction of oil and natural gas. And you can see that in the late 1970s and early 1980s, that investment just really went through the roof. And that took some time to come online, but eventually it did contribute to the fall in oil prices. And I think that example is a timely one for thinking about proposals to respond to bottlenecks with new investment. I think this example shows us that that is something that can have some effect, but it also has these time lags, which can be really crucial, right? This was investment that started in the late 70s and didn't really have its effect for a few years, by which point the political price for inflation had already been paid. So it sort of shows both sides of that coin. And again, this was not something just going on with oil. The graph on the right here shows you wheat yields in developing countries. And you can see that where there were a number of really bad harvests in the early 1970s that contributed to the initial takeoff of that mid-70s inflation, through the 80s, these yields, measured by product per area, right, per hectare, really grew. And so some of those binding constraints on food production were also loosened, right? So we can see the same principle at work. Okay, so that's my sort of survey of the 1970s and the way that the 1970s inflation was undone. Where does that leave us with reference to the current day inflation? Isabella covered a lot of this territory, and so I'll try not to belabor any points that have already been well established. I think the starting point begins before COVID with this acceptance of a low rate of unemployment and acceptance of a kind of high pressure economy, which is a phrase that was originally used in the 50s and 60s and is then revived by figures associated with the Federal Reserve around 2016 or 2017. And so there's a period between 2016 and the beginning of the pandemic when there's already been a shift away from this post-Volcker policy of basically running the economy below capacity as a matter of intentional policy. There's going to be an experiment with what happens if we didn't do that. That experiment is already showing, some effect on unemployment rate when the pandemic starts, and that transforms the nature of this inflation by disrupting supply chains at the same time that income is maintained. And so we saw, especially for the first stage of the current inflation, a market concentration of price increases on durable goods, consumer durable goods, especially motor vehicles contributed at one point, 40% of the increase in prices. More recently, we've seen the emergence of some inflation in services, and that's what this graph on this slide, which I took from a recent Bloomberg story, shows that there's some actually relaxation in the pressure on durable goods at the same time that there's been an increase in services. And this services inflation, I think, is especially politically significant because it's easier to tie it to wage increases, whether accurately or invidiously. The places where wages have increased in the United States are often in these service industries, whereas for durable goods, those things are often being made overseas, and it's harder to tie to labor market conditions in the US. I think on the other hand, it's very easy to tie a services inflation to conditions in the US labor market. And if there is to be an attack on the idea of a tight labor market or low unemployment, I think services inflation makes that case easier to make for those hawks. Finally, just recently, since the beginning of the war, and maybe a little earlier, based on the fears and rumors of war, energy prices have just been a huge component of overall inflation. And so this graph, which comes from Matthew Klein's newsletter, The Overshoot, shows that in the most recent measurement, motor vehicle prices actually fell, but you have this huge increase in energy prices, which is the largest part of that bar on the most recent reading. And so, to a significant extent, the problem now is a problem of energy prices, which I think, again, poses its own specific political problems, because as people interested in a climate transition, we don't see low oil prices as an unmixed blessing. And so I think that's created a real politically sticky situation for people on the left and even the center left. Now, a few days ago, the Biden administration's Council of Economic Advisors released its annual report. And that report, I think, gave us a good window into what thinking is within the Biden administration about how to deal with this. And I think their vision, such as it is, really puts a lot of faith into this expansion of capacity through investment, both public and private. And they see the government's big contribution, both to the economy in general, but also to fighting inflation, as relaxing supply constraints by coordinating and promoting investment. And they talk about this in two ways, which you kind of see represented in these two quotes. The first is to make targeted investments, say in port infrastructure, which will relieve pressure on specific parts of the supply chain. But they also, even in this report released a few days ago, I think it's significant, they're still standing by this idea expressed in the second quote, which is that high demand economies actually will increase the long run potential of the economy by keeping pressure on capacity and thereby incentivizing more investment. So they're still holding onto this idea that a kind of high demand, high pressure economy is not just a good thing for maybe income distribution reasons, but actually as a way of increasing the potential of the economy. So that's the sort of, to the extent that there's a programmatic vision within the Biden administration rather than a response to these short-term pressures, I think that's what it is. These two slides I think of as sort of the Biden administration's case for optimism, right? If they're trying to defend this vision, what is it that they look to sort of support that or to give themselves and other people hope? The graph on the left shows you new orders for capital goods from manufacturers, and it does seem that there's been a large uptick in those. So if the argument is that the inflation is a sort of path on the road to new investment, which will bring new capacity and will then relax pressure on prices, there's some sense of support for that. Although again, there's this question of how long that will take to actually show up in prices, and whether that lag time is too long for it to be a real political solution for the Biden administration or the Democratic Party. And the second graph that they like to show is this one on the right, which shows you core inflation. Now, core inflation strips out food and energy prices, which are thought to be especially volatile. And if you strip those out, you'll see that the trend is actually downward on the last two readings or so. I think everyone would say that's probably too soon to make too much of, but it is significant, I think, in how they're thinking about this, right? That they think the things that they do have some control over, which doesn't really include oil and food in this case, at least in any immediate time frame, are trending down. So if you're within the Biden administration, this is sort of what you're looking at to try to, feel like things are still on track. Then I think there's been an interesting dispute on the center left about this question of whether the labor market is really to blame. And the dispute divides the people within the White House and the sort of liberal economists outside of the White House. And here on the left, you have a tweet from Jared Bernstein, who's a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, where he's stressing that wage gains should not be blamed for inflation, and that in fact, if you lower the profit share of income, you can see an increase in the wage share without inflation. And I think it's clear that this is very far from being the official policy of the Biden administration, and yet nonetheless, I think it's significant that you see someone on the CEA saying this. It's been a long time, I think, since that kind of open discussion of a distribution between income shares has been part of any official government statement. And so that's significant. Just as significant, though, I think, is the fact that people like Paul Krugman are not buying it, and that they are calling, this columnist from a few days ago, calling for an increase in unemployment. And so I think that shows the stability of this kind of old-fashioned thinking, that the problem is labor markets getting too tight and the solution is interest rate policy. And so I think we have a kind of complicated situation where there's been a lot of new thinking and a lot of shifts in the discourse, but also many signs that at the end of the day, the conventional wisdom is not so different than it was 5 years ago. This slide is related to that last point about the income distribution, and it also affirms a lot of what Isabella was saying, which is that unlike the 1970s, we actually see profits at a high level. This graph in particular compares net operating surplus, which is a way of thinking about profit, to wages and salaries. And you can see that, in the 1970s, this was at a low level compared to the peak, in 1965. And so that's why we think of that decade as fundamentally about a profit squeeze on corporate income. And there's really no sign of anything like that now, which I think is good prima facie support for Isabella's sense that a lot of these price increases are opportunistic, although we'll see what happens to profits later. It's not clear what will happen, but up to this point, I think there hasn't really been a profit squeeze to speak of. The unknown in the projections for everyone is just whether there's a recession coming. It's very hard for anyone to know, I think, and there's polling on this, which you see represented here, which shows that most people don't expect it to come this year. At this point, I think most people still expect it to come next year. But there are signs of growing slack in the economy, and the one I chose to pull out here is a little interesting. It's a measure of when truckers who are contracted to carry something at a specific rate reject that contract. And you can see the rising green section shows the tightening of the trucking supply chain throughout much of the pandemic. And this index, which people in the industry think of as a pretty good proxy for the available capacity, has now come very close, to pre-pandemic levels. And so there's some sign that at least in some sectors of the economy, we may be seeing a kind of sectoral downturn. And I think no one really knows what the knock-on effects from that could or would be. Another comparison you could make between the 1970s and today is that in the 1970s, part of how stagflation worked was that inflation and rising prices eventually had an effect on consumer spending. Prices rose so high that people started to cut back their purchases of major goods. And so you can see in the top graph here, which shows you the 1970s, consumer spending started to level off and then decline as we approached the big contraction of the middle of the decade. And so I think that's a sense in which the inflation itself helped to contribute to the downturn. And if you look at today, which is the graph below, it's a little bit hard to interpret. And I've seen actually people interpret the same graph different ways. Some people look at the little downtick there at the end as suggesting that inflation is starting to impinge on consumer spending now. Other people seem to emphasize the fact that consumer spending is still relatively strong. But I would say this is a thing to keep your eye on and to look out for. Are price increases such that consumer spending is actually starting to take a hit, or are people continuing to consume at higher prices? And so if it's happening yet, it's a recent development and something to keep our eye on. Another thing that people point to if they are not worried about recession is that employment growth has sort of continued upwards even as inflation has risen. And that's arguably different from the 1970s. As you'll see in these two graphs, the employment growth in the 1970s started to flatline, around the beginning of 1974 when the recession started. And then there was a second sort of downturn and it decreased quite rapidly later toward 1975. We don't have evidence of this happening yet, but by the same token, the bottom graph here, which shows you the contemporary situation, shows that employment hasn't even reached pre-pandemic levels yet. And so there's a sense in which our sense that this is a strong employment market should also be qualified by our sense that it's also still in a way catching up to what there was lost during the pandemic. And then just in closing, I really wanted to sketch in a really broad way the horizon of what possible openings this moment creates for reform, including radical reform. And I'm not really very optimistic. I think the politics of inflation are quite bleak for people on the left and even the center left. But in the interest of spurring some conversation today, I did want to sketch out what some possibilities might look like. And some of these, as you'll see, are inspired by, I think, what the horizons in the 1970s for a kind of reformism around inflation were like. One point is to really try to use the inflation moment to strengthen the case for guaranteed and perhaps even decommodified access to the basic necessities of life. Healthcare is a major part of what people think of when they think about inflation, even if it's not reflected in the CPI. When people think about the cost of living, they might be thinking about a medical bill. So I think there's an opening here to try to insist on at least containing and perhaps eliminating those costs as one way of addressing people's concerns about these things in a way that doesn't require increasing unemployment. Secondly, we need to think about forms of income support, especially if this does turn into a case of stagflation. And there are various technical things that could look like various kinds of rebates or tax credits if prices go up beyond a certain level. People talked about before the current moment, they talked about having a gas tax along with a rebate, for poorer households. And I think now you could sort of think about the inflation as a kind of de facto gas tax and still think about having a rebate of some kind along with that. I also think it's worth thinking about what class-specific forms of austerity would look like. If we don't want to fight inflation by creating unemployment and lowering the consumption of working class households, what would it look like to try to impose an austerity at the top that was targeted at people whose living standards can stand to be reined in? And I think things like private planes are a good example of where we might start to think about that. Don't want to take too much time on this, and some of these are relatively self-explanatory. Maybe I'll talk about the last one. I think that there's an opportunity here to think about the expansion of a kind of public option for banking, including a bank account every American would have offered through the Federal Reserve. I think if there is going to be this message out there that there's too much spending and there needs to be more saving, there needs to at least be a way for people, all kinds of people, including those without access to lots of kinds of financial services, to save in a way that lets them partake in the rise in asset values and the rise in interest rates. So some kind of preferential treatment for people to save their money instead of spending it in a way that would let them see some return. And if you can do that kind of forced savings in a way that rewards people, you can maybe avoid needing unemployment as a way to minimize consumption. I think another possibility is to try to politicize defense production as a contributor to inflation. And if you read the business press, you'll see that one place these bottlenecks are really appearing is in defense production, which is a heavy user of certain kinds of capital goods, a heavy user of certain raw materials, and a heavy user of skilled labor. So I have some quotes here that are just anecdotal. I also have a chart which shows you that defense capital goods are not a huge part of the entire market for capital goods, but they are not insignificant. So recently, even with the big uptick in non-defense capital goods orders, defense capital goods constitute around 13% of that overall capital goods market. And so I think, one reason this occurred to me is that historically, a lot of the instances of stagflation, whether the sort of mini stagflation of the late 1950s or the stagflation that gets started around 1966, do come in context of a conjoined investment and defense boom. And it's often the case that defense production and capital goods production put pressures on some of the same sectors. And so I think if it is the case that we're now going to have to argue about making choices about real limits to production, one place that we should start to politicize choices about what to produce is defense production, which happens to be something that the government already has some measure of control over. It's also a classic example of a cost plus industry in the way that Isabella talked about, just literal sense, right? Where many of these contracts will cover costs, however high they go. And then finally, the trickiest thing I think is what to do about energy prices, which we see have become, a major part of the current inflation, and which, I think anyone who spends any time around people involved in the climate movement has, felt a sort of onset of despair recently, because the high oil prices and the centrality which that now has in politics have really taken the energy out of a lot of, more optimistic visions for an energy transition. And so this is something for people to think about and try to figure out. I think it reopens the question of nationalization, because the oil industry presents a special case where you might want them to increase production in the short run to hold down inflation, but you absolutely don't want them investing with a view towards long-term profitability. You want the industry to be killed at some point in the not too distant future. And so I think, even if you have a kind of liberal environmentalist lens on, I think it's hard to imagine other ways of both increasing the supply in the short term and winding down the industry in the long term that don't involve some kind of significant extension of state control. We know that people had that in mind in the 70s. I don't think there's much support for it now, but I think something like that now does become the horizon, especially as long as energy prices remain as central to overall inflation as they have been.
All right, Tim. Okay, well, great. Let's move it over to Aaron, and then individuals who are participating in the Zoom room with us. If you have questions after Aaron's comments, we recommend you raise your digital hand, which is like this feature on Zoom, and then we'll invite you to share video or audio and ask questions of the panelists in the Q&A. So, Aaron, please.
Great. I'm just going to keep my comments very brief because I thought those were both very interesting presentations, and I think we have some. I think we'll have a lot of really good questions from the audience. I just wanted to note some tensions in the presentations, I guess, and to ask the speakers about those. One thing in Isabella's presentation, you were talking, I think, towards the end about this possibility that the profit bonanza could become a profit squeeze later on. And that would suggest that these big price hikes and profit takes are in some way really are hedging, which was what you said on your first slide. But then there's a lot of reports that actually these companies are engaging also in record share buybacks and dividend payments, and which would suggest that they aren't holding the money for those reasons. It's really exactly what you were describing, this kind of Galbraithian process where they're taking advantage of the moment to raise prices in coordination and then to pay out shareholders. And that sits in a kind of uneasy tension with some of the material Tim brought out about investment. Because I really wonder, I mean, it just seems like depending on the indicator you choose, you get a very different outlook. Like, you know, Tim showed these big payments for capital goods from non-defense industries and not on aircrafts, but, you know, other measures of like capacity utilization in manufacturing, not particularly high, you know, investment share of GDP, not particularly high. What role is inventory expansion playing in this? If these companies are taking on, like if they're making huge profits and then just using them to pay out their shareholders, that would make it seem like they're just not that worried about the future in some way. Their expectations are that inflation is going to die down and they're going to be all right. They're not going to need the cash, nor are they making investments. So I don't know, between all of those things, I'm just kind of curious what you're seeing. Is there, some people are talking about the end of globalization and some measure of reshoring to kind of improve these supply chains. Is that what's happening with this investment, or is it all just kind of like little ripples on the larger story of firms just, sending their profits to shareholders? And then the other question I had is like, just to put some of the information that you both were presenting in terms of this larger story about the Great Resignation and what was happening in the labor markets. Just a few months ago, it really seemed like, due to the pandemic, like, all of these kind of adjustments of companies suddenly coming online again after not being online for a long time, as well as, just people dying in the pandemic or people not being able to return to work because they were taking care of sick people or they were newly disabled. It seemed like workers had a really good situation and that we were seeing the first really strong labor market since the late 1990s. But now when you add inflation into the mix, it seems like actually nominal wages aren't keeping up with inflation. We're seeing like long period now of actually declining real wages. Meanwhile, it seems like productivity is increasing. So like what you guys were showing, the capital share seems to be rising. And meanwhile, as far as I can tell, a lot of the strength that workers felt in those past few months during the period of the so-called Great Resignation was due to their having this savings cushion. There was a big savings cushion from the payouts. And at least what I was able to find online, it sounds like that's going away now. And that could imply, I don't know if that implies in line with what Tim was saying, that maybe we are heading towards a kind of cliff in terms of the ability of families facing declining real wages and eroding savings to continue to spend in the face of inflation. And I was just sort of wondering what we make of that, and it also relates, like everything about this economy feels like it's a Charles Dickens world of like, is it too hot or too cold? Like, is unemployment really low, or is it just that, the labor force was radically shrunken and now it's kind of coming back? Was workers' position really strong, or is it actually quite weak, measured by real wage increases? So those are sort of like the big questions about capital and labor that I just wanted to ask you about. I also wanted to know just briefly, the world was sort of momentarily not obsessed, but talking about MMT. And neither of you mentioned it, but it's sort of like this big question. All these people said there was major slack in the economy. Governments can just spend money. And if there's inflation, they can just tax it away and get rid of it. And, that's obviously not happening. And the MMT kind of discourse seems to be, I don't know, just dissipating in some way. And since this isn't Twitter, but an actual analytic conversation, I thought maybe we could actually talk about that in retrospect, what that looked like. And then I thought you both talked a lot about what you'd like to happen and what like a good account of dealing with inflation would look like. But maybe you could just speak a little bit more. It seems like we are in like a complete political deadlock. And once again, it's just going to be the central bank handling what happens. And so, is this what we're facing now? Is like, we are going to see, central bank, like they are just going to say, look, we're going to sell off our assets and raise interest rates. that's going to cause a recession. You know, the Republicans are going to win in the midterms, and we're just going to be living, you know, in the darkest timeline. So I had a bunch of other questions, but like I said, there's a lot of people in the audience here, so I'll just leave you with those 4 really big questions. And, you know, if you want to answer them now, or just take some responses from the audience and answer them with those, I think that would be fine too.
Maybe let's take a round of answers from Isabella and Tim to pick and choose from Aaron's comments about what they like to follow up on, and then individuals who are in the Zoom audience, please raise your digital hand, and we'll call on you in the next round. So Isabella, please.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. These are all really great questions, and I'm very happy we're having this discussion because I feel like it really is complex and there's a lot going on at the same time. So thank you for prompting us to look at some of these things more closely. As regards kind of the profit bonanza, profit squeeze, share buybacks, capital investment story, I think that the data that Tim was showing is not necessarily inconsistent with the record share buybacks. If the profit increase is sufficiently large, you can have both of these things happening at the same time, right? Which seems to be the case if we take these 2 data series that we have looked at, and then as you have been pointing out, there are other data series that complicate the picture. But just from what we have seen, I think it's not at all inconsistent. Why am I talking about a possible scenario of profit squeeze? I think it's politically important for the whole idea that the profit bonanza could have been one of the drivers of inflation, to also see that having a profit bonanza at one point doesn't mean that there can't be a profit squeeze at another point. And in fact, in some sense, they feed into one another, because even if it is the case that there have been some substantial amount of capital investments coming out of these large profits, if nonetheless these record share buybacks have been happening, right, then these companies have not been preparing for a profit squeeze kind of situation, right? Which means that if costs keep going up in the ways in which they look like they are going up, if we look at the commodity markets, if we look at the fact that now China is in shutdown mode in several key industrial areas, if we look at the breaking supply chains across the Eurasian continent, and so on, right, then it might well be the case that they continue passing on cost increases. But if households are falling off the cliff, as you have been saying, in terms of using up their savings, and if on top of this, and this brings me kind of to your last question, we have an interest rate hike and we have increased unemployment, then it's quite possible that households will no longer be able to absorb these increased prices. And in fact, if you look at the Bloomberg surveys, you can already see that, like, for spontaneous purchases of consumer goods and so on, the outlook has already gone down. And this has, I think, everything to do also with the fact that for essential goods, I mean, in the last CPI, the 3 things that have been driving it were food, shelter, and fuel, right? I mean, no one really can live in this country without fuel because you are so car dependent, and no one can live anywhere without food or shelter, right? So you basically have 3 components that are very, very inelastic, where prices are going up a lot, which means that even if savings were not to decline or nominal incomes were not to go down, the space that households have to spend on non-essentials is kind of shrinking, right? Which means that you have, I think, a decreasing capacity of absorption on the side of the households, which is, by the way, similar to what happened after the war, where you had this inflation dynamic where basically households had pretty high savings, and then everybody wanted to buy fridges and cars and washing machines and so on, right? And then prices for these things shot up, and people basically spent their savings on these completely overpriced durable goods, and then they did no longer have a lot of liquidity, and then you get these, and at the same time, production capacity had gone up in ways in which it hasn't gone up now, right? So this is the difference. But nevertheless, this kind of up and downward movement in terms of pent up savings, and then inflation followed by a downturn could well be in some degree in parallel. However, with the big caveat that the cost push dynamic is not over, right? Because the war is just starting. I mean, all of these cost push factors are in some sense picking up speed rather than dwindling out. So in that sense, that my outlook in terms of what is going to happen in terms of a realistic scenario is pretty bleak. And since I have a German accent, I may also say that I think in the European situation, we kind of see another replay of a confrontation of Southern European countries against Germany and the Netherlands in the realm of questions of how to go out about inflation.
Thanks, Aaron. Those are really great questions. I'm afraid I don't really have answers to them. You know, the investment question in particular is so it's so sector specific, right? And I, for one, find it very difficult to get a good sense, you know, through the business press, what's really going on in each sector. You know, it seems clear that you know, semiconductors and electric vehicles, there's like real capacity expansion going on there of some kind. I haven't, you know, done the work of seeing how that relates to the overall level of investment spending, you know, much less to GDP, but it seems like it's happening there. It would be interesting to know more about investment in services, right? I think, you know, anecdotally, we've all seen an increase in kind of self-checkout type equipment, right, which has been purchased in retail settings and in, you know, fast casual food settings. It'd be interesting to know how much of that is contributing to this growth and productivity, and how much that investment is contributing to the overall levels of investment. But it's just so hard to have an overall picture, and I think that accounts for some of this Dickens, you know, phenomenon you're talking about. You know, the other thing that makes this, you know, it makes it so hard to get a reading on things is that there's a question of what you're comparing things to. And I think often when you're reading people who are really optimistic about the economy, they're really stressing how much faster and stronger the recovery has been than it was in 2008, right? And that's kind of the baseline. But if you shift from, you know, how strong is the recovery to like how strong is the underlying system, those are maybe different questions, right? Which can't be answered using the same metrics. And so I think those are great questions. I wish I had a better like sectoral breakdown, you know, for you today. It seems like a project that people should work on, you know, maybe some people here in this room, because it's just really important. And it's, you know, it's hard to find an answer to. I had a thought too about MMT, which is, you know, I think I agree with you to a certain extent that there's been a fall in the stock of MMT, so to speak, you know, as inflation seems to reemerge as a binding constraint. But I think at the same time, you know, at some point in the sort of online intellectual history of MMT, they made this shift from talking about taxation as the way to deal with inflation to really going all in on these, you know, sector specific, looking at bottlenecks, looking at various kinds of capacity. I think they were involved in that intellectual shift towards, you know, this kind of sectoral nerding out, which I think has been really useful, you know, and it clearly is having an impact on the business press and on, you know, the Council of Economic Advisors. It's not clear to me how much is having an impact on, you know, I don't know, wherever decisions are really made, and I don't know where that is either. But I think that they do have that legacy that's not just the purely fiscal side of things, but in that, you know, that insistence that inflation isn't just one thing, which I think was a kind of, you know, was a development within the history of MMT that isn't necessarily there in the original articulations of it, that focus much more on just putting money in and taking money out.
Isabella, did you have another point?
Yes, sorry, I wanted to follow up with 2 quick points, if I may. So on the MMT question, I think one thing that they have been saying consistently is that it's not about how to pay for stuff, but how to resource things, right? So in that sense, this whole question of resourcing has been part of the narrative, but hasn't been represented necessarily as loudly in the popular debate around MMT. I wanted to echo what Tim was saying on the question of data. Even if you look at profits, and I had prepared like sector level profit data, and then I decided not to show it because the thing is the level of disaggregation that we have right now is like 16 industries or so. And if you look into corporation level profits, you find that sometimes within these industries, things are developing in very different directions. So for example, retail, Amazon had the best time ever, but maybe the bodega had the worst time ever, or even Walmart had a not such so great time, right? And if you lump the two together, then you don't see anything anymore. So the level of aggregation really matters for these questions. And yeah, so this makes the whole thing very complicated.
Okay, we got a couple hands, so let's move to our audience. So Melanie Brusseler, okay, you're welcome to turn on your video and audio and ask everyone or individuals a question.
Hi, yeah, my name is Melanie Bressler, and this is a bit of a broad, open question, so hopefully you'll bear with me, but I've been personally struck by the way that it seems like there is an opening, or at least a relative turn towards some level of economic planning for the green transition, both in the US and Europe, although it's quite sporadic. It's, you know, nowhere near adequate to the climate crisis, but we do see the Defense Production Act being invoked for battery minerals, but not for anything else. Even amidst this oil and gas capital strike, there's no talk of nationalization or even, you know, just partial state intervention. Meanwhile, in Europe, even though ostensibly they're in a wartime mobilization to move away from Russian gas and towards decarbonization, it seems like it's still quite constrained. There's no moves towards fiscal union, let alone direct public investment in renewables, even while certain member states such as Germany seem like they're going to be taking a much more active hand in terms of planning and investment in renewable like input or input capacity. So I just would be curious for your thoughts on what you see as potential short-term possibilities with some of these more muscular state intervention, but then also, you know, clearly what the limits of that are.
Okay, thanks. Let's take a question from Andrew Elrod.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello. Hi, I had a question, I guess specifically for Isabella, but also broadly, I guess for the whole panel. Isabella, you started to actually get into this organically just now in talking about the disaggregation of profits data by sector. But my question is about what do we know about capacity estimates? It seems to me that, you know, a margin of excess capacity has historically and theoretically been a kind of guard against inflation. At the same time, it seems like, you know, some of the input output data you were using, at least my understanding of it is that it you know, those accounts show, you know, the value of output. They don't, you know, they're not, maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but they may not be the best source of statistics on actual volumes or quantities. And then the Federal Reserve has this, you know, table 17, what is it, G17 or something, but the Federal Reserve has its own capacity estimates and utilization estimates, which I, you know, seem for some reason not to be, you know, the most accurate. I mean, I know that the survey method itself has changed, and much of the original private surveys that they used in the 50s, you know, don't even exist anymore. So just and from a level of information, you know, what do we know about capacity limits, existing unused capacity, and is there a way, you know, today and in this moment in history, given the weakness of the political organizations of workers and the fact that, you know, the left is really still an insurgent and not an ascendant force in national politics, is there a way in this situation maybe to approach inflation as an information problem or a knowledge problem, and that, you know, would that not open certain political possibilities that you know, you know, are on the table? But really, I would like to hear, you know, what we do know, or what, you know, what you know about capacity utilization, because it just seems like such an important part of this whole debate over the high pressure economy that is not really ever seriously openly discussed. And,
okay.
and thank you for having this. This is a phenomenal panel.
Thanks. This is this has been a technical conversation. I want to ask a political question and follow up on something Aaron said, which is Aaron used the word deadlock. Given that so many of these kind of left liberal reform proposals are back in the conversation, whether temporary attempts at price controls or ramping up investment, kind of public direct investment, these, given the legislative breakdown in the United States and same extent in the EU, I mean, how likely is this as not only as a viable option, but even a realistic option for a kind of, a left liberal approach to dealing with inflation when the monetary hawks have this kind of chemotherapy that can basically, attack the entire economy. And that's the benefit. And then they say, well, in absence of any other policy, this is what we have, and we need to do it now because even though we know that it's actually unsure whether inflation would not have gone away without the Volcker shock on its own, or would have gone away without the Volcker shock on its own. But it seems like, there's a good legislative deadlock in the United States, given our experience of the last few years. Is this a viable option, or is this just something that people like to discuss? But let's take a round, Isabella and Tim again.
Yeah, thank you. These are all really great questions. Andrew's question on capacity utilization. I think that there's not only a data problem, but I think that there's a conceptual problem in the sense that if you have a lot of supply chain issues, then let's say you have a high-end bicycle assembly place in the US, okay? And you have everything to assemble your bicycle, but the tires. Then are you at full, how much of your capacity are you utilizing? It's not so clear, right? So you have these very highly compositional elements that are an expression of the globalized supply chains, where the capacity is not really one factory that produces everything, that is locally contained. And then you can say how much more capacity to produce 100 more bicycles do I have with the workers that I have, or something like that, right? This is just not the world we live in, which means that this whole idea of capacity utilization becomes extremely fungible and very, very difficult to measure as far as I can tell. On the input-output question, so what I've showed you is basically a simulation, and this is still extremely preliminary, and we're still working on it and so on. So it was very daring of me to show this, but I think it's important to kind of get us going to even think about these things, because I think this really matters. And I think even if you go back to the AER publications of the 1970s, you find that kind of getting rid of the importance of relative prices for aggregate prices is one of the big intellectual shifts, and to kind of get back into thinking about relative prices and their relationship with the general price level. I personally think that input-output is a useful tool. Does this tell us exactly what is going on in the moment? No, because the input-output table that we are using is from 2019, because the 2021 has huge issues because it's 2020 and everything is shut down, and the 2021 is not there yet. So in that sense, it just gives you a tool to understand possible multiplier effects within the economy, and it gives you a tool to understand what are industries and commodities that matter. It won't give you a live picture of what's going on in the economy. And I wish, in fact, in Germany, it's quite, saying hilarious is probably not taking the situation seriously enough. But to answer the question of what will happen if Germany no longer imports gas, you would need a pretty fine-grained input-output table as the best estimate that you could come up with, I believe. But you don't have this. So you have this gigantic fight between German economists that are all basically in the dark, because they don't know the input-out relationship, at least not in a fine-grained enough manner that would help you understand what the implications could be. Is inflation also an information problem? I'm not sure if I would call it an information problem, but I think it is important to kind of bring the public sentiment into the picture, and that you need like certain legitimation mechanisms to enable the increase of prices and to have these like, kind of coordinations across sectors, as I've been trying to describe. On the whole question of green planning, so I think that, and this relates to what Tim has been saying, I think, yes, of course, we need more investment and all of that, but I think we really need to make a very clear distinction between short-run emergency measures and like medium to long-run kind of planning and investment mechanisms. And if one think, and this connects into Kevin's question, if one thinks about these things politically, and if one takes seriously that Le Pen is, I mean, whatever will happen there, but she certainly managed to benefit hugely from the cost of living crisis that was that is linked to all these dynamics that we have been talking about. If one takes this seriously, then I think coming up with emergency measures that prevent this inflation from spiraling further out of control should really be the absolutely highest priority, because if this continues as it is, it will be very, very difficult to win elections, even for candidates that we might not be necessarily excited about, but to basically prevent the very worst outcomes, right? Yeah, I leave it at that. Maybe one more sentence on the whole like globalization question. So I mean, along the same logic of time horizons that we are looking at, I think this idea of onshoring supply chains in a situation where basically even the existing supply chains are not really operational is in some sense a thing of impossibility, because if you want to reshore supply chains, I mean, you need so many machinery and inputs and so on that is not possible in a short-run scenario. And given this political dynamic, I think whatever one thinks about reshoring supply chains in terms of the nationalist implications and so on, but even if you're on board with this and you think this is the solution to the problems that we have, then in the short run, it's not going to work. And I think the short run is really what matters here from a political and an economic viewpoint.
Okay, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. Those are also great questions. I think I'll start with Melanie's. You know, when the pandemic started and people first started to talk a lot about the Defense Production Act, you know, my reaction was, you know, how horrible that we have to do this through, you know, this Cold War era law. We must, you know, we should have a peacetime way of doing this. And since then, I've just been continually struck how little they've done with it. You know, I mean, on the one hand, they invoke it all the time for these like little things, but none of them have ever amounted to very much. And you know, I haven't followed this super closely, but as far as I know, that's the case with this most recent lithium and other minerals for batteries order. As far as I could tell, the meat of it was really just to give some government funding for feasibility studies, you know, to look for new mines, which, you know, I guess is a first step. But, you know, compared it to me, I still feel like there's this really striking refusal to use state planning capacities, even under this wartime guise, which is, you know, just like worrying to me. And I don't really know what it would take to change that. I do recommend to everyone, if they haven't read it, a report put out maybe 2 months ago by Employ America about existing statutory powers that the government could use today to deal with oil prices. You know, if we bracket for a minute the thornier problems with, you know, increasing capacity in that particular industry, it might illustrate certain points. And, you know, they point to the fact that energy producers now are really, even at a time when prices are very high, are unable to engage in a lot of capital spending because shareholders, partly because they were burnt by the last boom and bust in energy prices, shareholders are really reluctant to approve this kind of capital expansion. And so even at a time when, you know, in some textbook world, the market should be expanding capacity, it's not happening. And sort of starting from that situation, the Employ America folks propose using both the Defense Production Act and also the Treasury Department's Emergency Stabilization Fund to selectively finance certain kinds of investment with certain kinds of targets and conditionality on the investment that's undertaken. And so, if you're trying to see where this might start, it might come from the situation where businesses find it really hard to invest, and then you could find a kind of alliance between managers who want to invest and the government against the shareholders who are imposing capital discipline. But I think, like you, I've been struck by the absence of a really strong planning initiative, despite some of the discursive shifts. And I just, Kevin's question, I think, is a invitation to return to Aaron's question, which we didn't talk about in the first round, which is what really will happen. And I think I said before, I'm not very optimistic. The one quasi-optimistic note I would add is that, a hawkish turn by the central bank is not a sort of either or thing, where they give up on this ease and then it's just back to Volcker. The way it was reported, a lot of people focused on, I think, people said Powell needed to have his Volcker moment. Maybe Powell himself reiterated his, admiration for Volcker. But we're really quite a way off from that level, of interest rate hikes. We'll see what comes. But I think that even as, there is this growing consensus that things have kind of gone too far and need to, be walked back. And there's still a sense that interest rate policy is the only game in town. I think the kind of interest rate hikes they're talking about at this point are not really going to be sufficient to solve the problems. And so to a certain extent that, that window will remain open in some sense, but, where will the force come through to push anything through that window? Your guess is as good as mine.
All right, let's invite my colleague, Professor Cesar Ayala, to ask a question. Cesar, you want to turn on your video if you can?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me, okay. Yeah, I have a question. I know this is about the short term, but I kind of have a question about the long term that this short term is sitting on. So it seems like we've seen at least a medium term increase in the price of commodities driven by the industrialization of China. And I'm just kind of going in my mind about sort of the scenarios in case, Volcker comes back, Paul Volcker reincarnates and we get some interest, shock in our economy. So of course, the global South would have a debt crisis instantly, but would it have deflation of commodity prices? And would that be different because of kind of the long-term trend in demand for commodities on the one hand? On the other hand, talking about the global South, I saw the graphs about the possibility of famine, in North Africa and so on and so forth. That's terrifying. To the North Africans, it's gratifying to the Argentinians and Brazilians who export soil and wheat to the world market, to China and so on and so forth. So here's a big question: would a U.S. interest rate hike affect the world economy like it did in the 70s, given the reduced weight of the U.S. in the world economy, particularly on the demand side of commodities, of raw materials?
Okay, thanks. Let's take a question from Jim Dingaman and then Natalie Leonard, and then we'll go back to the panel.
All right, thank you very much for your very thoughtful comments. I was sort of curious to hear what the panel thinks about if they can concretize this into the practical politics we're dealing with right now in the United States, because we have the midterms coming up. There are predictions that there will be a recession at the time of the presidential election in 2024. So the problem I have is, how's this going to affect? I watch and read the behavior in polling, which shows inflation is very much uppermost in the minds of the average voter. So how does the panel think this is going to play out in our politics in this country in terms of essentially exacerbating reactionary trends? Because we have predictions that the GOP is going to take the control of the House and the Senate. We have the possibility of Donald Trump running again. And I don't have to tell an audience like this, the globalized policies of trends towards fascism are all throughout the world. So how do you all think about these kind of developments affecting us, not only here, but everywhere?
Thanks, Jim. Natalie?
Yeah, thank you so much for this panel. It's been really great. I'm wondering if you could speak to the capital or shareholder or investor side of inflation dynamics, which hasn't really come up yet. And it seems like it's a really odd story right now. Like the normal story would be that asset holders want price stability. They might want the Fed to control inflation through hiking. And this seems to be backed up by market risk reactions to like Board of Governor members and the FOMC announcements of quickening the pacing of tapering and tightening and interest rate hiking. But on the other hand, there's this story that of like profiteering through this period, that shareholders have been benefiting from this conjuncture, not so worried about maybe near-term or long-term inflation. And then also just the basic logic that interest rate hikes decrease asset values. And so how should we think of the response of capital to these inflationary dynamics and how that might affect like the way forward in the next year or two?
All right, let's take a last round of responses. Isabella, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add to this whole question of timing and interest rate interventions and so on, that I think we really have to think of the logic of fighting inflation in parallel with the logic of fighting a fire. So if you initially have like fires that are very sectorial, then you have certain things that you can do about these local fires. Once a fire becomes very widespread and takes on a complete life of its own, then it becomes increasingly more difficult to do something very targeted and specific, which then also plays into the hands of those who want to do these like very broad-based kind of inflation responses, right? So that you kind of get these reinforcing type of dynamics between political and economic kind of priors and the actual development of the inflation. In terms of the question of how does this look like from a capital perspective, I think what is interesting is that basically we see a new kind of formation of the capital block, and I see that my camera is just blurred, which it sometimes does, where if you, for example, listen to Goldman's commodity guru Curry, he's talking about banking as an old industry, right? So you basically have a situation where banking used to be one leading block of the capital formation, if you want so, but now in an age of asset management and so on, you suddenly get BlackRock arguing against interest rate hikes, which has to do exactly with the asset price evaluations that have been mentioned. So in that sense, you get a very different kind of power dynamic on the side of capital compared to how it might have been in the 1970s. I'm not an expert on this. Others like Ben Brown, who I think was on the call earlier, have done so much research on this, so I can just give this general comment here. On the political implications, I mean, I personally am very, very worried. There is a very long and detailed track record of all sorts of historical constellations where rapid increases in prices of essentials have led to very stark political reactions. And the left seems to be shattered in the current moment. I mean, in the context of the war with Ukraine, even more than it was already before, is my sense, which means that if there is such a political reaction to these increases in essential prices, it's pretty likely that this would take a very regressive right-wing kind of form, which in the current climate, I think is a really pretty terrifying outlook, and is for me the motivation to try to intervene in these discussions around short-term measures against inflation. Thank you so much for organizing this, and thanks everyone for these really, really terrific questions. This has been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim,
yeah, all these questions have been so fantastic, including those last two. I was thinking about your question, Cesar, and it seems like, if we want to think through that scenario, we might think less about the Volcker 79 through 82 moment and more about the 73 through 75, global depression really earlier in the decade, which was consistent with a continued, pretty strong basic commodity price market, right? And if you were a country like Mexico or something, you would have continued to borrow from Walter Wriston throughout that, thing, and the process of growth of indebtedness, a sort of worldwide demand shock, was still consistent with rising commodity prices, right? At least for a time. And people, Volcker kind of made people forget about this, but at the time, people saw the Federal Reserve's policy in that recession as quite hawkish. This was made clear to me when I read a Business Week piece from the beginning of the Volcker shock, where they say, of course, the Fed has done bone crushing, deflation before. Burns did it in '75, which is just the opposite of the way everyone remembers Burns now, because he's been kind of turned into this, mythological figure of, pussyfooting around. But he wasn't, and no one felt that way in the mid '70s. And so maybe, I haven't really looked into that, but it'd be interesting to think about the Global South perspective on that moment as a, potential something that could illuminate our thing today. And then Natalie, that question is one I've thought about a lot and also found it hard to get a good answer on, right? The idea that this asset price inflation is in some sense dependent on easy money. And does that mean that finance now has a different set of interests than its, traditional hard money orientation? If we have time, I'd love to hear what Professor Brenner has to say about that, because he's, as far as I know, the coiner of asset price Keynesianism as a term. My only contribution is that, shares are not the only asset, and that the bond market has seen a lot of drama recently, and so even if we're in a different moment from the 1970s in terms of the S&P 500, there are other equities and assets out there that the owners of which might have an interest in tightening things up.
All right, the bat signal has gone out to. Oh. Somebody I was unmuted. Okay, the bat signal went to Bob Brenner, but I think Bob might be turning in a last minute essay for someone. But I want to thank Aaron. Aaron, do you have anything to add?
I'll just thank the two speakers, because I thought that was really brilliant, and it's very difficult. I know. I mean, as a historian by training, though maybe sociologist now, but as a historian by training, I think, being a historian or having a historical outlook and then trying to comment on current events is always quite difficult. Though I think historians have a lot to add to the conversation. So I thought those were both just really brilliant presentations and answers, and it's been a really great panel all over.
All right, I want to thank Isabella and Tim, as well as Aaron and everybody who signed up, and encourage all of our viewers to sign up to the Center's listserv. We're going to be having an event in 2 weeks, I believe, Rohan, on
yes, hopefully in 2 weeks, yeah.
On the power of finance, with some additional equally eminent guests, one of which will be Professor Michael McCarthy, who's currently in Los Angeles, the Berggruen Institute. So thanks everybody for watching and participating, and we'll see you at the next panel. Thank you.